Inner Voice, a heartfelt chat with Dr. Foojan.
Break free from the forces holding you back. Get the life you deserve. Eliminate stress, reduce anxiety, decrease depression, and start living your full potential. Thousands have used Dr. Foojan Zeine's awareness integration theory, an evidence-based behavioral health breakthrough with incredible life-changing results. Getting rid of past trauma, having fulfilling relationships, increasing earnings, and living their best life. Now, the Foojan app is available to everyone. The app is Dr. Foojan Zeine's awareness integration theory in the palm of your hand. Download the Foojan app today.
Do you wish to wake up one day and hit the Life Reset button? Life Reset, the awareness integration path to create the life you want by Dr. Foojan Zeine, helps you navigate crucial life areas, heal the past traumas, and cultivate fulfilling relationships and careers. Life Reset is your guide to a profound journey to reshape your life. Grab your copy on Amazon or Audible now and embark on a path to a more joyous and fulfilled life. Welcome to the Inner Voice Heartfelt Chat with Dr. Foojan podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Foojan Zeine, a psychotherapist and author and the creator of the Awareness Integration Theory. So thrilled to have you join us today. For I truly promise you to be an insightful discussion. I'm so excited to speak with and chat with Dr. Max Krasnow. He has earned his PhD in psychology in 2010 from the University of Santa Barbara and joined the faculty department of psychology at Harvard in 2013. He teaches in Harvard's Division of Continuing Education. His research focuses on evolution and cognitive design of human social behavior, among other topics. He heads the Harvard Evolutionary Psychology Lab, where you can find all of his publications. Professor Krasnow had been my professor as I've taken courses. I'm taking a graduate certificate in the topic of human behavior from Harvard Extension School, and he's been my professor for evolution of psychology course. It was mind-boggling to go through this course. I've learned so much, and the conversation of one of his latest papers is about are humans gender binary or non-binary, which is a topic that we're consistently having a conversation about in the world of psychology, the world of like the school systems, in politics, and all in all. So I've learned a lot from him. I think this was a wonderful opening on many layers of genetics, epigenetics, culture, society, and I'm positive that you'll enjoy it as much as I did. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on my YouTube channel and connect with me through my website, foojanzeine.com, or any of my social media platforms. Share your thoughts with me. I'd love to hear from you. Seriously, share with me what you like to hear. What are some of the topics you're interested in? And I'll bring the best and the best for you for us to have those discussions. Now, without further ado, here's Dr. Max Krasnow.
Intentional Parenting, a practical guide to awareness integration theory, written by Dr. Jafari, Dr. Foojan Zeine, and Dr. Manoukian, three experts in human development, is your step-by-step guide to raising a healthy child prepared for a culturally integrated world. You're supported in parenting infants to adolescents using the latest evidence-based scientific research on parenting. Order your copy on Amazon now.
Eliminate stress, reduce anxiety, and decrease depression. Dr. Foojan Zeine's awareness integration theory has helped thousands like you get incredible life-changing results. The Foojan app gives you her evidence-based treatment in the palm of your hand. Download today.
It is so nice to have you, Dr. Max Krasnow. It is such an honor. You have been my professor for the past term at Harvard Extension School, and I'm learning evolutionary psychology, which is fascinating to me because I've come from a clinical background, really a practical background, and you've just kind of like opened my world to a whole different realm, which surprisingly enough, although I work with a lot of empathy and compassion, but I really got that when I have more of an understanding of us as part of the species and how we've come forward, then my level of compassion and understanding got so much more. So thank you for that, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It was definitely a pleasure to have you in class, and that's exactly the experience that I've had learning about evolutionary psychology from first being introduced and then having the 20-year career that I've had, that it really allows you to appreciate humanity in a deeper way.
Yes. So one of the subjects that you are writing a paper on, which is very interesting and very controversial, and I've worked with 30, almost 32 years of being a therapist, working with gender identity issues, sexuality issues. I've worked with transgenders, gays, lesbians, the whole spectrum of LGBTQ and straight. And one of the conversations that keeps coming up, not only in the world of parenting, raising your children, in the world of politics, in the world of society, rules, regulations, is this concept of sexuality and sex gender being binary or non-binary. And I know personally, although I've sit with people and I go through and their experience and they share with me, but there's still some times when we can't really grasp this an understanding of how does it all work? And you really bring definitive answers to this concept of, is it or isn't it? So you share first about how is it? So can you share with us how it shows up as a biological construct, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. And one of the funny things that has always kind of struck me as I've been, a participant and observer of this culture is how so much of the science here is settled, but so little of it is actually understood by the public. And so the first question you asked is, how is sex categorical, two categories, binary? And the answer is, first, that it is in one way, and that is the way that biologists define sex. And the surprising thing to most people about that definition is that it doesn't have anything to do with genes. It doesn't have anything to do with chromosomes. It doesn't have anything to do with the bodies around your genes. What it has to do with is whether, based on the typical development that your body would have gone through, do you or would you produce sperm or eggs? If we go back 1 billion years to the first time sexual reproduction evolved, and by sexual reproduction, what that means is two parents mixing genes to create an offspring as opposed to one parent just cloning themselves. If we go back that 1 billion years to the first sexual reproducers, they had sex with each other, but they didn't have sexes. They didn't have male and female. They made packets of genes that were the same size. They weren't sperm or eggs. And each individual could mate with any other individual of the species. They were all mutually compatible. Over the next several 100 million years, sexes evolved. Some of those individuals within the species ended up making smaller and smaller packets of genes. Those became sperm. And the others made bigger and bigger packets of genes. Those became eggs. And there's a longer conversation that we could have about exactly why that happened. It's very well worked out in the theoretical biology. But in a nutshell, that's the definition. And that's the definition that biologists use throughout the animal and plant kingdoms. Every species that reproduces sexually, where some of them make big sex cells, gametes, sperm, and others make large gametes, sex cells, eggs, it's the egg makers that are female and the sperm makers that are male. And that can happen for so many developmental reasons across species that it can blow your mind. There are species where it is the mechanism is the gene you get from your father. It's the gene that got passed in the sperm that sets whether you end up making sperm or eggs. For other species, it's a gene that gets passed on through the egg that determines whether you're going to make sperm or eggs. For some species, it's what temperature was the egg that you grew from, what temperature was the environment that it was laid in. If it's high enough, you're one sex. If it was low enough, you're the other. For some species, it's about the composition of the social group. It's about, is there a sperm producer in the group? And if not, you grow up to be a sperm producer. And sometimes it goes the other way. If there's not an egg producer in the group, you grow up to be an egg producer. And this is really just scratching the surface of the wide diversity of ways that nature has come up with designs for producing sperm makers and egg makers. And that is the fundamental reality of sex categories.
Beautiful. You also share that for some, we only see this as the chromosomes of XX are female and XY are male. And that's not how the category always stays, that there are so many different categories of that can be a possibility. And that it's not just the genetic, that you also shared in your paper, that the environment of the mother who, holds the baby and is developing the baby, a lot of the conditions might actually change. And you also talked about an early puberty, which is on a toddler side almost, that also again changes those. And then, then we also have the puberty of the adolescent. So can you share a little bit about how all of the other aspects of the epigenetics factor affect this concept of the spectrum and the continuum of the binary concept?
Yeah, excellent question. And so that transition, when we go from the theoretical biology where sex is binary, any other way you look at it, sex is a continuum. When we think about those chromosomes, right, we kind of intuitively, once we learn about them, or even we're taught that XX means female and XY means male when we're focusing in on humans, there's so much variety in that. So if you look within bodies, that, again, it'll blow your mind. There are lots, and there's a non-trivial number of people who have Y chromosomes in their bodies, but don't end up having developed male anatomy. There are people with no Y chromosome in their body that did end up developing male anatomy. There are people who have 2 X's and a Y. There are people who have 3 X's. There are people who have many of their cells having XX, but some of their cells in their body being XY, and vice versa. One of the craziest cases that I've heard of is this story about how a man had a paternity test done. He and his wife had a paternity test done over their son, and it came back that he was not the father of their son. And they were flummoxed, they were floored, and they went back and tried to figure out how that could possibly be. Well, where they sampled the DNA from for the paternity test was his saliva in his cheek. But that's not where the DNA for that child came from. That DNA for that child came from his testicles, right? From his sperm. And it turns out that in his body, he had 2 different genomes. He was essentially, his body was the result of twins that had fused in utero to develop a single body. But that body was composed of cells of different people. In his case, it was two people who had Y chromosomes, but it doesn't have to be. And with the exchange of cells between mother and baby while mom is pregnant, that also allows XX cells to go into XY individuals. And you even have cases where XY fetuses send those XY cells into mom, and then she sends those XY cells into her next daughter. And so women who have older brothers likely actually have some amount of cells from those brothers that have continued to replicate in their body. And we have, every one of us has that. It's referred to as microchimerism to one degree or another. And so the idea that we're all uniformly in our bodies, either XX or XY, is just scientifically baseless.
So the interesting factor of the biology and the psychology of the matter shows up as there's a way that we categorize, and then we live through these categorizations and create, societal rules for each other and move forward. So if we had the idea of the biology is fixed, then if we're looking at this continuum, sometimes we look at it, okay, it's a choice, or it's a malfunction, or it's because it's somebody's choice to be different. And then the way that people deal with it, it becomes very different. Now, regardless of whether it is a choice, which is still beautiful, or that there is really some biological factors that are not just so fixated as people believe it is, then it seems like there's a different way of looking at all of this through acceptance. And that's what I was talking at the beginning, where when you're looking at this bigger picture, you can come through about, this isn't about right or wrong. This is about looking at how it is and accepting that, yes, so if we don't fit into categorization, and if we are in so many realms, the continuum of all of that, then it makes living with it, whether the person is not experiencing themselves and having to fit themselves into two categories, or by parents who are dealing with their children and have to kind of come back into how I handle this to the society and the norms. It just seems like it creates a bigger understanding and a bigger way of like living together in a different way, which is healthier for everybody, versus constantly either you're in part of this categorization or you're bad and wrong. Is that kind of what I'm hearing based on what you're sharing?
Yeah, and we can go back to pretty much any point in history and find ideas about parenting or ideas about how people work that we later learn are just devastatingly wrong, right? Within the clinical psychology world, we remember the idea of the icebox mother and how a cold, now this is in the figurative sense, a cold mother who wasn't emotionally connected to her child, the idea was that that was a cause of schizophrenia, which, despite the fact that that was firmly believed in for decades, we know that that is scientifically and empirically baseless. So we all have, and it's very easy to have, ideas and intuitions that are just wrong. And so we should always be open to the possibility that things that we think are true are not true. Having an open mind and being humble about the things you know is one of the most important things that we can do in order to have a civil society, in my opinion. Now, thinking about how people come to look and feel a certain way, we tend to simplify that into nature and nurture, right? It's either that it's fixed and we can't change it, or it's simply the result of how we raised those kids. And the science really since the start has shown us that neither of those options are true or even could possibly be true. The only answer is that it's a combination. It's a gene by environment or a nature by nurture interaction that co-determines the development of the system. And that there are so many influences on how we develop as people that you can't really separate them into one thing in isolation and point to that piece as the one piece that mattered. From the beginning, we have genes that get transcribed, read into gene products like hormones and enzymes and proteins. And there are chemicals in the uterine environment, the environment that we're in as fetuses while we're growing. There's chemicals that then interact with those hormones and proteins and enzymes. And those can be made by us, those can be made by mom, those can come in to mom, to us through the environment that mom's in based on what she eats or breathes or drinks. As we grow up, those programs, those effects keep cascading, and they keep having interactions with things that are being read out of our genome and environmental experiences that we keep having. The social environment, what we're experiencing, the microbiological environment, what we're eating and drinking, and the chemicals that we're exposed to, the developmental environment of when certain hormone levels are experienced throughout your development. And that story is so complex, we're only recently really unraveling it, and we don't understand it nearly well enough to be able to feel confident in saying that there's any one thing that is the main determinant of anybody's experience of their own sex, gender, identity, or exactly how they end up having the body that looks the way that it does. We have some good partial answers to that question, but we don't have complete answers to that question. And if we compare, I think, that scientific uncertainty with the intuitive certainty that we feel that when we look at someone that's a male, that's essentially a male. And if we look at someone and we say female, that's a female, unchangeable. Like the fact that we have that feeling, but the science tells us otherwise, I think that's a really interesting pattern. You asked about how we end up at this place of acceptance where we can understand how something is without jumping from that to a moral disposition, like how it ought to be. There's this idea in science of the naturalistic fallacy. And this is a reasoning fallacy that is common in people. We commonly make this logical leap that is just not warranted. And the naturalistic fallacy is the idea that if there is something that is naturally that way, that is the right way for it to be. You can see this showing up in kind of the past ideas of the noble savage, or presently the idea of a paleo diet. We think, for example, if a baby was born with a particular genitalia, that was the way that they were supposed to be or should be, and that if they act differently than we think they should act, that's a moral, we put something moral on that. But we can think in 5 seconds of examples where that's just not true, right? In the natural state of things, germs infect us and we often die. If we look at people who are still living today in the traditional ways that our ancestors lived, like as hunter-gatherers, at least as over the last several 100,000 years, they die at a rate from infection at a rate that far exceeds the way that we die, because we have modern antibiotics and modern medicine. We wouldn't say that we shouldn't use antibiotics because our ancestors didn't use antibiotics. That would be ridiculous. Obviously, the state of nature doesn't tell you what is good or bad. we take our value structure and we impose it on that to tell us what is good or bad. And because we're doing that intuitively, I think it means that we need to step back and kind of be mindful and reflect on whether the application of our morality is happening the way that we want. Are we, if we think about it, applying the moral intuition that is consistent with our values?
Same conversation shows up for me a lot, even with categorizations, with characteristics of human being. I think that it's easier for people. They make it, they try to make it simpler and easier when you put people in categorization so that you know how to deal with them. When things are too vague, I think people get scared. They have anxiety about how to deal with that. We know that every human being, and even animals, they have a sense of belonging. So in order to belong, it's easier to name it something and try to belong to that name and the categorization and all of it. So it produces this concept of, let me have a name so I can belong. And then from the rest of the group is also like, let me see if these features or whatever it is, it's similar. So then we could take you as a belonging. So when you go on a spectrum, then you don't know kind of where you belong because you're trying to fit yourself in the category and other people are trying to figure out where you are in the category. But I also see, we've had a lot of debates with psychologists that, you know, in order to, again, categorize, like, human beings' character are this or this, or, you know, you take a test and then they fit you into 4 categories. And I always, like, you know, have a lot of resistance to being categorized, because when you see human being in their raw format sharing with you, you know, you can switch, your personality switches, it changes, you grow, you shift, you could pull any of these characters at any point when it's necessary. But I'm sensing that the same conversation of how do we first understand and then fit into a category is part of what we're also trying to do with the, you know, the gender concept and sexuality concept. And it's interesting in how to be at ease, trying to be at ease with what is and shows up versus being threatened by what shows up. And to have this concept of seeing the bigger picture of the variety of who we are as human beings, whether it's the gender or sexuality or characteristics. And like you said, how many of these pieces work together in creating that human being at that moment in every stage of their development, which is not the same as, you know, who you are at a 2-year-old, 10-year-old, 50-year-old, 80-year-old. And you're continuously in the spectrum of shift, which is the beauty of, you know, the experience of growing up is this beauty of really watching and growing and opening ourselves into that perspective. But I remember I had one client, a couple who came to me, and I watched their beautiful daughter who was born as a daughter and was changing in their puberty and had actually a lot, like a beard, and had a lot of hormonal shift. And the mother could just not accept this. And she kept saying, you know, I've checked her chromosomes. This is XY. It cannot be anything else. I'm sorry, XX. It cannot be anything else if it was. And there was this, she was also a scientist, but she was kind of just caught into that concept of chromosomes and could not accept her daughter for this beautiful change that was happening. And the daughter couldn't figure it out. She just knew something is changing with my body. I have no idea. I don't belong to any things that you guys are saying to me, because I can be a female, but I prefer to, my body's changing somehow, some parts of it to act as if it's a male. And then yet my preference is to wear male clothes and see myself as male, although I also have a lot of not only still female features, but also behave like what the society says what a female will do. And this confusion between the family a child who was growing up and the parents who were trying to really put their mentality around all of this and their feeling, and the grief of the mother, like, I gave birth to a daughter and I don't know who this person who's in front of me, I don't know what to do with this. It's excruciating sometimes when you're going through all of this resistance. There's a lot of pain in that resistance of acceptance of who we are.
Absolutely. I think you connect two issues that are fundamental to this controversy and kind of traumatic moment that we're in as a society. One is the hallucinated nature of categories. And then the other is the psychology of fairness and interpersonal relations. What you said about categories was perfect. That in nature, if we look around the world, almost everything that we see truly is a continuum. You can open up your photo editor and your color picker won't be categories of color. It'll be a smooth gradient of color. We can look at our watch and see that it has units of minutes, but we know that there's many seconds in those minutes, and there's microseconds in those seconds, and time is continuous even though we categorize it. In psychology, we talk about people who are extroverted or introverted, but when we look at the data and we reflect on our own experiences, it's a continuum from extroversion to introversion. And you're exactly right that one of the reasons we do that is so that we can communicate. Like, you can't have a word for every single one of those points on a continuous spectrum because you would have to have an infinite number of words. And that's uncomfortable when you don't know how to express an idea to somebody else. How do you let them know that you're right here as opposed to right there? And so we want to be able to express categorical information to each other. That's what makes us comfortable in communication. One of the things that we have a hard time understanding in that communication is being able to empathize with each other's perspectives and positions. We intuitively know this, but I'm going to make it explicit, even though it's going to sound obvious. A lot of what our social interaction is about is negotiating around costs and benefits. You ask somebody to do something for you, you're thinking about intuitively, how hard would it be for you to do? How hard would it be for them to do? What's the benefit of them doing it for you? Is that balance fair? And if it's fair, it feels right. If it's unfair, it feels wrong. It seems like something, if they asked you to do something that was unfair, that might make you angry. And the problem that we face, particularly around the experience of sex gender identity, is that it's really hard to empathize, understand, or experience mentally somebody else's experience of their own gender identity. So I like to give the example of being misgendered, because I think that really speaks to this variable that psychologists have identified, which they call gender strength. And just briefly, what gender strength is for whatever gender identity you have, how strong is that identity for you? How important is that as a part of your own identity as a self? Now, me personally, I have very low gender strength. As an example, I answer the phone, it's a telemarketer, and they know my name. They say, "Is Max Krasnow there?" I say, "Yes, this is he." And I guess because of the pitch of my voice or something about the way that I present on the phone, I will get ma'amed very frequently. I'll get misgendered as female. And I couldn't care less. It doesn't bother me at all. And so for somebody like me, when somebody else tells me that they've been misgendered and that it's painful for them, it's hard for me to imagine that because that's not how I experience things. And that makes it hard to understand the true nature of the costs and benefits. And that's going to make it feel like I'm going to see something as unfair that you see as fair, and you're going to see something as unfair that I see as fair. And that's the perfect grounds for us to have a fight.
What you just said is so true about our personal experiences and how do we feel safe and not. Because I think that when I feel safe with who I am, another person's view of me, as long as it doesn't potentially create a threat, then it doesn't matter. You know, it's okay if you see me any other way that you do, because I'm okay with who I am and I'm okay with however you're going to see me. But when there is, whether through our upbringing, there was a duality between this, which it was like you weren't supposed to be that, or you were normal, you know, there were some labels on it. And then somebody else from outside world says something where it brings my what I called inadequacies at that moment because I made it to be that, then there's a part of me that is going to be not only upset, but is going to take a stand for a justice for me in a sense, because I'm having a reaction toward it. So it is very much about a personal experience of the gender, not only, again, the biology, the genetics, and all of it, but with all of that, there's a personal experience and a narrative that I put in about who I am and how I fit into a world. And do I feel safe in this world that I'm operating in? And it seems like when the safety is there, the person expresses themselves freely. And if there are people who are not coming at them or toward them with the viciousness, that their safety just carries them and they're okay with who they are. So
I think you're exactly right that we in society, there's a running commentary about how did we get to this place where it feels like more and more people are having a trans identity or a non-binary identity. Feels like it's more than it was before. And then there's lots of ideas about where that's come from. But of course it's about safety. If you face violence for expressing your identity, you're not going to express your identity. And if it's become easier and safer for you to express who you are, more people will express who they are. And that's a perfectly straightforward explanation for rising rates of people identifying as non-cisgendered, meaning the gender that people assume based on their bodies and based on the way their bodies looked when they were born. This allows me, I think, to get to some what I think is relevant data. I think that people often want to make, if they're criticizing this idea that there is such a thing as gender identity that is separate from sex, or if there is such a thing as a trans identity or a non-binary identity, you hear a lot of times people say, that's not biological fact, or that's just liberal culture, or that's just wokeness, right? They want to make it about people's cultural and political ideals now. Well, if you look around the world and you look back in time, the data doesn't support that premise because we have historical evidence of trans and non-binary identities going back over 1,000 years in cultures around the world. It's not just because people have progressive ideas now. It's because this is a part of the human experience. And again, learning how something is doesn't tell you how it should be, but it does give you an opportunity to apply the values that you want. Like, if you believe in those American ideals of equality and, you know, living in a pluralistic society where different kinds of people can live equally before the law, apply that to this gender identity diversity or sexuality diversity. Recognizing that those people exist and they're just as valuable as you, apply your values. Doing that in a mindful way, I think, lets us move through this issue.
Very much. I had the blessing of working with a male who body was male, and she felt a female even when she was 5 years old. But because of a military background, the parents wouldn't even deal with it. And was very afraid that if she would come out as trans, then, you know, her father would kill her. I mean, that's how terrorized she was. So we went through this transition, and I was pleasantly surprised that she was working at this company, which was very male dominant, military based, and all of it. And as we worked through, and she had the ability to go and talk to the HR and say, now I want to start with dressing at work, and, you know, as a female, and how the HR prepared the steps and how smooth this transition went. I mean, obviously, after many years of therapy and getting her strong enough to take a stand for herself, but I was actually very impressed by the company. And I remember she said it was interesting because obviously the bathroom conversation was part of the deal, but she said it was just interesting that the same people who saw me as male on a Friday and dealt with me as a male and would tell me jokes and sexual jokes and, you know, all of that, suddenly as I showed up on Monday, fully dressed as a female, they were now treating me in a different way, like in a respectful way, like they wouldn't say those things in front of a lady anymore. And they got, you know, some people who were like, no, I'm not dealing with this. I just don't even want to look at it. And then there were people who, you know, it took a couple of weeks before they got used to it. And then it was interesting because the whole thing out of the fear, out of all these transitions, just changed that our therapy became about how do I walk in a high heel as a female now, because I don't know how to do it. And it was this beautiful transition of just coming out of fear for so many years and trying to enjoy and play now with who you were going to be, you know, in a different state where, yeah, some people are going to accept you and some people won't. And, you know, having to deal now with relationships had to be different now. You know, you had to talk about it and find who you were going to be safe with and who were going to accept you. And it was a whole new learning, but it was coming out of that shell first and then start learning how to be you and accept what the world showed you. So these have been beautiful experiences that I've been privy to. Our time is coming to the end. Is there anything we haven't shared about this topic that you really wanted people to know and kind of wrap up and conclude?
Well, I would like to just kind of and the last thing that you talked about. And this is less about the science than it is about the way that we can apply the way we feel about adults' behavior and just think about kids in a similar way and give them the same grace that we give adults. So just like you were talking about that client of yours who, when they were able to express themselves, they needed to figure out how to walk in heels. And they may walk in heels for the next year or two as they're exploring that part of their identity, but then they might not. They might move into a completely different way of being and living and deciding that comfortable shoes is the way that they want to be. Now, when adults are playing around with their identity, going into different phases, maybe, becoming the pickleball person or becoming the gym person or becoming the leisure person or the book person. And we all do that throughout our lives. We completely accept it when adults do it. But sometimes we don't give kids the same ability to pick up and put down aspects of their own identity. And imagine if everyone around you was telling you, as soon as you picked up that first identity that you were trying on, the makeup and high heels identity, that way of being a female. If people around you said, once you picked that up, you had to stay that way, and you couldn't put it back down, and if you did, it was bad, and anything else that you tried to do, they wouldn't let you do. That's going to be a traumatic experience for you. And it puts you back into that place of danger and threat, and you can't be your authentic self. But we don't have to treat people that way. We can let people try things on, toss them aside, or keep them. It's up to them. And we've always seen kids do the same thing. We know kids go through phases. They can be goth for a while, or emo for a while, or Swifties for a while, although I might, get in trouble for saying anyone could stop being a Swiftie. We don't traumatize them over that flexibility. If we simply let kids try out different gender identities, and if they then settled on the one that fit best for them, wouldn't that be best for everybody?
I usually say, just wait until 25. It all kind of falls into its place. You don't have to worry about it. Just experience the experience until you're a young adult, and somehow we just find our place. Yeah. It was beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the step and time to be with us. I know that you also, how could people find you? I know you have the evolutionary psychology lab at Harvard. Are there ways that people can find you, read your material, your papers, your published papers, or your work?
Thanks. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk with you too. So you can find my lab's website if you search on the internet for Harvard Evolutionary Psychology Lab. The lab is not currently active, but you can still see a record of all of the past research. All of the papers are there to download. Personally, I think Google Scholar is my go-to resource for finding papers. And so if you just put my name into Google Scholar, you'll find my papers there too. And I've had a handful of talks and debates and interviews that have gone up on YouTube. So that would be a place that you could find some of my work as well.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again for taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you.
Same here. And for all of you who are out there, create an amazing life for yourself and everyone around you. And until next week, bye-bye.
Are you a psychotherapist looking to enhance your practice? The Awareness Integration Therapy developed by Dr. Foojan Zeine is a comprehensive guide to the principle and techniques of this powerful therapeutic approach. Join the growing community who have elevated their practice and expanded their skills by embracing Awareness Integration Therapy and witnessing its life-changing impact. Order your copy on Amazon now.